She waited until the coffee went cold before she spoke. Then she said, "If you won't reconsider, we'll take legal action." I stared at her across the kitchen table, the same one where I'd eaten birthday cake at 8, cried through my first heartbreak at 16, and signed my first lease at 22. The same table where my Aunt Celeste now sat like a stranger. I'm Amber, 29 years old, and last month my grandfather left me his entire estate, worth over $2 million. The day after the funeral, my mother Patricia demanded I sign it over to her. When I refused, she didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. Now she had summoned me for a family breakfast, which turned out to be a confrontation, with her, my stepfather Craig, my 2 younger siblings, and Celeste, her younger sister, all seated in calculated silence. There were 2 men in suits waiting by the window. Lawyers. I should have known. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. But inside, I was cracking like ice. Because nothing prepares you for the moment your family stops pretending they love you and starts treating you like an obstacle. Celeste looked at me with cool detachment, tapping her lacquered nails on the table. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said. I replied, "I'm honoring Grandpa's wishes." Craig scoffed. Jason, my brother, was already texting under the table. Rachel was crying, of course. And my mother, she smiled. That smile she always used when something had already been decided without me. The moment they slid that document across the table, something their lawyers had drawn up just to simplify things, I realized this wasn't about grief or fairness. It was about control. And I wasn't playing that role anymore. What I said next. It changed everything. The room didn't explode like I expected. It just stalled. Like something sacred had been dropped and shattered, and no one wanted to be the first to look down. I said, "I won't be signing anything today." Craig blinked, as if he hadn't actually expected me to speak. Celeste exhaled like someone who'd just watched a dog bark at a judge. And my mother's mouth curled into that half-smile I'd known since childhood, the one she used when she believed time was on her side. It was always like that with her. Not direct confrontation. Just erosion. Quiet pressure. Years of unspoken hierarchy. I stood, tucked the unsigned papers back into the folder, and walked out. The morning sun was slicing through the trees as I stepped outside, but it felt like standing in the shadow of something colder than winter. I didn't cry. That wasn't how it worked for me anymore. But my jaw ached from how tightly I was clenching it. Driving back to my apartment, I replayed the conversation again and again, but it wasn't the words that haunted me, it was how familiar the betrayal felt. Because this wasn't new. This had been building for years, brick by brick. My grandfather, Harold, had seen it. And I think, in his own way, he'd been preparing me. He was the only one who ever treated me like more than an extension of someone else's convenience. He spoke to me like a person, not a role. Not a daughter. Not a buffer. Not a cleanup crew for emotional messes I didn't make. When I was 13, he handed me a worn ledger and asked if I could find the error in the supply chain. I did. In under an hour. It was the first time anyone had looked at me like I was capable of something real. We used to sit in his old office, just the 2 of us, surrounded by the scent of cedar and old receipts, and he'd walk me through margin sheets, logistics plans, and staffing models. He said, "Anyone can make money. Few know how to keep it." My mother used to call it Harold's little hobby. As if teaching me the mechanics of his life's work was just a grandfather indulging a child's whim. But it wasn't that. He was handing me something sacred. I still remember the way his hand trembled the last time he signed a payroll sheet. He'd glanced at me and said, "If you do it right, they'll call you cold. If you do it wrong, they'll call you foolish. Don't let them define you either way." He wasn't just talking about business. He was talking about survival. Because in our family, women were only allowed to be 2 things, decorative or dependent. My mother had mastered both. She married young, dressed well, and let Grandpa's stores fund her illusions. Every financial crisis she ever faced was someone else's fault. Every bill unpaid, every overdraft, every late fee, blamed on bad luck or bad men or bad timing. Never bad decisions. When Craig came into the picture, nothing changed. He just nodded along, co-signed where it was convenient, and kept himself just useful enough to avoid scrutiny. The house I grew up in was a revolving door of unspoken resentment and maxed out credit. By the time I was 16, I'd memorized every excuse they used to deflect responsibility. I also memorized every overdraft charge on the joint account Grandpa had once opened just for emergencies. I never touched it. But they did. Constantly. The summer before college, I took a second job shelving books at the public library. My mother said it was unbecoming to work when your family owned a business empire. That was her version of pride, disdain disguised as tradition. When Grandpa fell ill, I was the one who drove him to appointments, reviewed his prescriptions, sat with him in silence when he was too tired to speak. Not because anyone asked me to, but because no one else would. In those final months, he asked me once what I wanted out of life. I told him, peace. And choices. He squeezed my hand and said, then protect them. No one else will. I didn't understand the weight of those words until after the funeral. Until the kitchen table ambush. Until my Aunt Celeste, who hadn't spoken to Grandpa in his final year unless it was about transferring assets, showed up at the house with a Cartier watch and a corporate lawyer. She was only ever around when something could be skimmed, signed, or inherited. She and my mother had always moved like sharks, quiet until blood hit the water. I hadn't seen them strategize together since the year Grandpa threatened to cut Patricia out of the will after she drained one of the business accounts to fund Rachel's private school tuition. They'd united then, too. Played the victim. Gaslit him into reconsidering. Made him feel old and paranoid and out of touch. He forgave them. I never forgot. I still have the ledger where he scribbled notes in the margins. A checklist, really. People he trusted. Accounts to watch. A final line in blue ink, amber equals clear eyes. Even now, I can feel the indent of that pen stroke like it's carved into my palm. I didn't respond to my mother's text later that day. I didn't answer when Jason called, probably coached by Craig. But that evening, as the sun dropped low and the light turned golden against my living room wall, I opened the old cedar box Grandpa had left for me in his study. There was no key. Just a brass latch, slightly rusted from years of humidity. Inside were his journals. His will. And 2 sealed envelopes, one with my name on it. The other with no name at all. My hands were steady when I picked up the one marked for me. The letter inside was handwritten, dated 3 months before he passed. I read it once. Then twice. Then again. And by the time I folded it and slipped it back into the envelope, I knew I wasn't just going to defend what was mine. I was going to reveal what they thought they had hidden. Because Grandpa hadn't just given me money. He'd given me evidence. And when the time came, I'd use it. Carefully. Quietly. Thoroughly. Just like he taught me. But first, I needed to find out what was in the second envelope. The one with no name. The one they didn't know existed. And if it held what I suspected? The next time we sat at that kitchen table, I wouldn't be the one feeling cornered. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Not physically, but in the way things feel when you know they'll shift something in you the moment you open them. I didn't tear it. I unfolded it gently, carefully, like it might breathe if I treated it softly enough. Inside were 4 items, a signed copy of Grandpa's power of attorney, a notarized letter naming me executor of his trust, a short handwritten note in block script, "Keep this safe," and a USB drive taped inside a business card from his estate attorney. The same attorney who had been absent at the kitchen table that morning. The silence in my apartment felt like the eye of a storm. Not peace, just a momentary pause before the next crack in the sky. I slipped the USB into my laptop and waited. There was one folder. It was titled simply, Herald, Contingency. Inside were scans. Dozens of them. Financial records. Transfers. Contracts. Quiet arrangements my grandfather had clearly made without telling anyone, except maybe his attorney. Many of them had Craig's name. Others mentioned my Aunt Celeste in passing, buried in business filings and revisions to the operating agreements for his stores. There were wire transfers going back 6 years, modest amounts at first, then larger. Loans with no repayment schedules. Notes from Grandpa about temporary assistance for Patricia's household, contingent on Amber's education not being compromised. That note was dated just 3 months before my student loans were denied for exceeding annual limits. So that's where the money went. Not to my tuition. To the same people now threatening to sue me for withholding family assets. I didn't shake. I didn't rage. I just sat with it. The kind of betrayal that isn't sharp or sudden, but dull and deep, like falling through ice and realizing no one is reaching in after you. The next morning, my phone lit up at 7:14 a.m. It was Rachel. She said, "They want you to come back. There's been a development." I asked, "Is it legal or emotional?" She hesitated. Then, both, maybe. By 8 a.m., I was sitting back at the kitchen table. This time, the lawyers didn't speak first. My mother did. She said, "We've reviewed Harold's documents. Some things are complicated." The tone had changed. Less condescending, more cautious. But I didn't mistake it for humility. It was strategy. Always was. She gestured to a stack of folders. "We'd like to revisit the distribution plan. There may have been oversights." I replied, "You mean he didn't leave you what you expected?" Silence. Then one of the lawyers, a man with thin lips and nervous fingers, cleared his throat. He said, "There are pathways for contesting the will, of course. But they'd take time. Resources. Publicity." I looked at him flatly. That sounds like a threat disguised as advice. He didn't deny it. Celeste was quiet. Her eyes scanning the table, the window, the wood grain in front of her. She wasn't leading today. That told me everything I needed to know. They'd seen something. Something in those documents had made them nervous. And I could guess what it was. Grandpa had been smart. But more than that, he'd been deliberate. He didn't just make decisions. He made them defensible. Every transfer, every revision to the trust, every business restructuring, he'd documented it. Which meant if they tried to claim he was coerced, I had proof he wasn't. If they claimed mental incompetence, I had timelines. Doctor's records. Notes in his own hand with dates and signatures. I didn't bring up the USB. Not yet. I said, "I'll review whatever you've prepared. But I'm not agreeing to anything without legal counsel." My mother's expression flickered, just enough to register. She hadn't expected me to be calm. She'd expected panic. Or at least, hesitation. Instead, I stood and left again. The folder she'd given me was already unzipped by the time I got home. Most of it was thin, probate documents, a revised schedule of preferred asset distribution, and a proposed agreement that would allocate 40% of the estate to a shared family investment trust controlled by Craig and Celeste jointly. I didn't laugh. But I wanted to. It was such an obvious power grab, wrapped in the language of unity. They hadn't expected to be disinherited. And they were trying to fix it the only way they knew how, by making me feel selfish. I forwarded the packet to my attorney. A woman I'd met through Grandpa's financial planner. Her name was Lily. Quiet. Sharp. The kind of lawyer who didn't posture, she documented. We met that Friday. She read everything twice before looking up. She said, "They don't have a case." I replied, "They have pressure. And history." She nodded. "But no legal footing. If what you've shown me is all legitimate, and it appears to be, this trust is airtight." I hesitated before sliding the USB across the table. There's more, I said. She spent 2 hours reviewing the files on her own, asking only one question the entire time. Did Harold ever discuss these transfers with you while he was alive? I said, only indirectly. He warned me there'd be pushback. Lily nodded again. He was preparing you. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because the shape of my role in this family had fully shifted, and I didn't know what it meant yet. All my life, I'd been the observer. The quiet one. The one who made things work in the background. Who didn't ask for attention. Who didn't take up space. But now they were forced to look at me. Not as a daughter. Not as a niece. As a threat. And the thing about being underestimated for so long is, by the time they notice you're standing, you've already built a strategy. Lily called the next morning. She said, you have 2 options. We can respond formally. Or you can meet them face to face, with the truth. I didn't hesitate. I said, schedule the meeting. I'll bring the files. And as I hung up, I realized something I hadn't dared to admit before. This wasn't just about the money. It never was. It was about taking back the narrative they'd built around me. The one where I was grateful. Quiet. Dependent on their approval. That version of me no longer existed. And when we met again, I wasn't going to defend myself. I was going to dismantle them. But I would do it gently. Just like Grandpa had taught me. Some wars aren't won with shouting or spectacle. Some are won in quiet rooms, with steady hands and facts that cut deeper than anger ever could. I spent the next week in preparation. Every spare minute outside of work, I reviewed documents. I flagged dates, annotated letters, created a timeline that stretched across 6 years of hidden withdrawals and rewritten family narratives. I didn't drink coffee. I didn't go out. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. It wasn't secrecy. It was containment. Lily called it strategic reserve. I called it survival. Every scanned receipt, every amended account statement, every clause Grandpa had modified in the trust, these weren't just legal defenses. They were confessions. His way of recording what he couldn't say aloud without setting fire to the people he still hoped would change. But I wasn't hoping anymore. I printed everything. Laid it out across my living room floor like a mosaic of quiet betrayals. There was the line item for Rachel's tuition, charged to one of the business accounts without approval. The check Craig had written to his brother-in-law for consulting, cashed 2 weeks after a family argument over garage renovations. The memo from my Aunt Celeste's husband, requesting reimbursement for an international flight he never took, signed off by Patricia without authorization. All of it tucked beneath a layer of practiced civility. All of it defended, if ever questioned, as family needs. I remembered Grandpa's words, money is responsibility, not reward. That was the line they had crossed without hesitation. And now I was standing on the other side. I met with Lily twice that week. The first time, we mapped out my leverage. The second time, we discussed outcomes. She said, they'll never admit what they did. But if we give them the choice, walk away quietly or risk exposure, they'll take the quieter path. I asked, do you think they'll retaliate? She looked at me carefully. If they do, we'll be ready. I nodded, not because I needed the reassurance, but because I already knew. There's a kind of clarity that comes when you have nothing left to fear. When the worst they can take from you is already gone, the illusions, the hope, the longing for fairness. I'd already lost all of that. What remained was mine alone. The final piece came the day before our meeting. A small manila envelope in my mailbox, hand-delivered. No return address. Inside was a letter from Grandpa's estate attorney. It read, Amber, Harold instructed that this be delivered only if disputes arose following the execution of his will. I trust you'll use its contents wisely. Enclosed was a recording. Not video. Just audio. Grandpa's voice, steady, thin, but unmistakably lucid. In it, he outlined the reasons for the trust, the decisions he made, the steps he took to protect me from what he called the machine that consumes everything it touches. He named names. He stated dates. He even acknowledged their likely objections, and rejected them in his own words. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't cruel. It was surgical. And when it ended, he said, "If you're hearing this, Amber, it means they've come for what I left you. Don't give them anything they didn't earn. You already know what to do." I listened to it 3 times. Then I backed it up to 3 cloud accounts, 1 encrypted USB, and a secure archive Lily maintained for clients under litigation. By the time I walked into the meeting, I wasn't nervous. Just focused. The conference room Lily had booked was all clean glass and cold air. Minimalist. Clinical. Like a stage where nothing personal could survive. They were already seated when I arrived, my mother, Craig, Celeste, and both lawyers. Jason and Rachel were absent. Probably a tactic. Or maybe they'd simply been told they weren't needed for the negotiation phase. Patricia didn't smile this time. Celeste looked older than usual, tight around the eyes, lips pressed thin. Craig kept his gaze on the table. I sat without greeting them. Lily opened with the basics: confirmation of parties, purpose of the meeting, ground rules for confidentiality. Then she nodded to me. I slid the first folder across the table. Labeled, Transfers in Violation of Trust Protocol. They didn't speak. Second folder, Unauthorized Asset Access. Then, Discrepant Business Write-offs. Each one laid carefully, methodically, without commentary. Finally, I pulled out a smaller envelope. It contained a single-page transcript of the recording. My mother's hand moved slightly when I placed it down. Almost like a flinch. I didn't play the audio. Not yet. I said, "This isn't about revenge. This is about restoration. These documents detail misuse of funds, attempts to bypass designated estate terms, and coordinated efforts to reframe legal ownership. I'm not pursuing charges. But I am drawing a line." Celeste whispered something to her lawyer, who quickly flipped through the folder. Craig remained silent. My mother finally said, "What do you want?" Her voice was brittle. Not broken, but strained, like glass under pressure. I answered, "A formal withdrawal of your intent to contest the will. In writing. Immediate dissolution of the family trust proposal. And a signed agreement to cease contact regarding estate matters moving forward." She didn't reply. She didn't have to. Because they all knew, I wasn't bluffing. Lily reached into her bag and pulled out the formal terms. Printed. Dated. Legally binding. They didn't sign then. Of course not. They asked for time. Their lawyers requested 72 hours for review. We agreed. But as I stood to leave, Celeste spoke for the first time. She said, "He never saw what you were doing to him. Manipulating him. Turning him against us." I didn't flinch. I replied, "He saw everything. That's why I'm sitting here. And you're sitting there." Then I walked out. The cold air outside hit me like a benediction. Not relief. Just clarity. I didn't know what they'd decide. But I knew one thing for certain. They weren't expecting the next document I was preparing. The one Grandpa never signed. But I would. Because there was one last store in his chain that had never transferred ownership. And its lease was still in Craig's name. Sometimes, power doesn't look like fury or force. Sometimes, it's just a quiet signature on the right line. The lease transfer had been buried in a backdated file and signed but prepared. Grandpa had drawn it up a year before he died, probably intending to finalize it during one of his better health spells. The store in question, his original flagship location in Hartley, was technically still under a long-term lease Craig had negotiated years ago when he was managing day-to-day operations. It had been one of the few responsibilities he hadn't fumbled entirely, only because Grandpa had handpicked every vendor and Craig's role had been largely ceremonial. But here's the thing, ceremonial agreements don't hold up well without maintenance. Especially when the managing party fails to renew critical insurance policies. I found the lapse by accident, buried in an invoice folder Lily's assistant had digitized for due diligence. The liability coverage for the Hartley location had expired 2 months ago. Which meant the business was vulnerable. And since I now owned the trust, and the trust owned the business, and Craig had allowed a critical breach of contract, I had legal grounds to terminate the lease. I didn't want to be cruel. But I also wasn't interested in another conversation about unity or legacy. So I did what Grandpa would have done. I walked into the Hartley store on a Thursday afternoon, calm, dressed in neutral tones, carrying nothing but my leather folder and a pen. The manager on duty, a woman named Leslie I remembered from childhood, froze when she saw me. She said, "Amber? I haven't seen you since." I nodded. "I know. I'm not here for a social call." She led me to the back office. There were still photos of Grandpa on the walls. A younger version of him. Stern, but proud. Arms folded in front of the store's original sign. It struck me how clean the place felt. Not just physically, energetically. It hadn't been tainted yet. That made the next part easier. I reviewed the current staff roster, noted the vendor contracts, and verified inventory records. Craig hadn't been physically involved in months. Leslie ran the place. And she ran it well. When I asked if she'd be willing to stay on under new management, she didn't hesitate. She said, "Of course. This store doesn't belong to Craig. It belongs to Harold's legacy. We all know that." That night, I drafted the termination. It wasn't dramatic. Just firm. A clean dissolution of Craig's operational authority due to breach of lease terms and failure to maintain insurance compliance. The paperwork went out the following morning by certified mail. 2 days later, Craig called. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He just sounded stunned. He said, "You didn't have to do that." I replied, "You did it to yourself. I'm just finishing what he started." Silence. Then, "Do you know what this will do to your mother?" I said, "She'll survive. She always does. But this time, she'll do it without my inheritance." He hung up. Lily filed the change of management with the state registry that afternoon. And just like that, the store was mine. Not just in name. In truth. I didn't gloat. I didn't post a press release or show up to gloat at the next family dinner, if they even dared hold one. Instead, I spent the following week reviewing every operational file. Payroll. Vendor logs. Past complaints. Leslie and I sat down twice, once over coffee in the stockroom, once over dinner at a quiet place Grandpa used to take me when he wanted to talk without being interrupted. She told me how Craig had ignored maintenance requests, how suppliers had begun to withdraw from long-standing contracts under his management, how employees had quietly left over the past 2 years and no one replaced them. I took notes. And then I made decisions. I raised wages for the remaining staff by 6%. I renegotiated the vendor contracts on 90-day cycles to keep flexibility. I authorized renovations for the back office, including updated tech and new ergonomic furniture. Nothing flashy. Just respect. By the time the 72 hours had passed, and we met again in that same sterile conference room, I wasn't the one carrying folders. They were. Their lawyer, this time a different one, younger, softer around the edges, presented the signed withdrawal of their claim to contest the will. No eye contact. No parting shots. Just surrender dressed as diplomacy. Lily reviewed the documents silently, then nodded. We shook hands. A formality, nothing more. My mother lingered at the door. She said, "You've made this much harder than it needed to be." I looked at her calmly. I replied, you were counting on me not making it hard at all. She didn't deny it. Craig kept his eyes on the carpet. Celeste walked out first. The door closed behind them like a final syllable. Lily waited until the elevator pinged before speaking. She said, it's over. I shook my head. No. Just balanced. Outside, the sky was pale gray. Thin clouds moving like silk across the horizon. There was no celebration in my chest. No rush of victory. Just the quiet realignment of something long dislocated finally falling back into place. Later that evening, I visited Grandpa's grave for the first time since the funeral. I didn't bring flowers. Just the final statement from the trust, proof that everything he built remained intact. I stood in silence for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees. I said, I did it. The way you wanted. And for the first time in weeks, my breath didn't catch at the end of the sentence. But I wasn't done. Not completely. Because there was still one thing I hadn't shared. One document I hadn't mentioned. It had nothing to do with money. And everything to do with legacy. And it had Celeste's signature on it, dated 3 years ago. She probably thought I'd never find it. But I had. Some truths don't detonate. They erode. Slow and exacting. And by the time they're visible, it's already too late to undo the damage. Celeste's signature was clear, neat, and undeniable. A contract for consulting services between her limited liability company and one of Grandpa's subsidiary supply chains, drafted 3 years prior, submitted 6 months later, and quietly dissolved just weeks before his hospitalization. The agreement was padded. Vague descriptions of logistical alignment support and corporate wellness strategies. But no actual deliverables. No logged hours. No emails. Just transfers. Steady, quiet, and always just below the audit threshold. But the contract itself? It had a clause she probably didn't read. An indemnity line, standard for internal partners, which required repayment in full if services were not rendered and the client passed within 18 months of the agreement's termination. A clause Grandpa had added to all contracts post-2017. A clause that Celeste's attorney missed. And now that I had control of that subsidiary, I could enforce it. I didn't want revenge. I wanted accountability. I filed a formal claim through the company's legal compliance team, not as an act of aggression, but as procedure. Let the process handle what emotion couldn't. Lily reviewed the filing and said, they'll try to settle. Quietly. I said, then we do it quietly. Celeste's attorney responded 4 days later. Their offer was modest, barely more than a symbolic acknowledgement. A fraction of what had been paid out through the contract. But I declined it. Not for the money. For the message. Because if I accepted that token, it would make everything feel transactional. And this wasn't about dollars. It was about the hours Grandpa spent auditing accounts after midnight. The times he called me in to review logs, not because he couldn't manage it, but because he didn't want to do it alone anymore. The betrayal wasn't in what they took. It was in how little they thought he'd notice. How little they thought I would. Celeste eventually agreed to repay the full amount, but only under a non-disclosure agreement. I signed it. Not because I needed to hide what she'd done. But because I didn't need to speak it out loud anymore. My peace didn't depend on her shame. The funds were returned to the trust and earmarked for a scholarship initiative I'd started drafting with Grandpa before he passed. A small program for students in rural areas seeking vocational training. Mechanics. Electricians. Small business operations. Real things. Working class dignity. He would have approved. By mid-autumn, the estate was formally closed. All litigation threats withdrawn. All internal audits finalized. All roles transitioned. I was no longer the granddaughter who got lucky. I was the acting trustee of a regional business legacy. And people began to treat me accordingly. Vendors addressed letters to me directly. Employees from stores I hadn't visited yet sent handwritten notes. I wasn't seeking admiration. I just wanted stability. It came slowly. Quietly. Without fanfare. But it came. My relationship with Rachel shifted too. Not a reunion. Not warmth. Just clarity. She sent me a voice message late one night, after the settlement terms with Celeste had been filed. She said, "I think you did the right thing. Even if none of them will say it." I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care. But because her words weren't for conversation. They were an acknowledgement. And sometimes, that's enough. Jason remained silent. Craig, too. I heard rumors he'd taken a consulting job in another state. One of those vague titles people use to rebrand collapse as reinvention. Patricia sent one final email. Not an apology. Just a list of medical bills. Unpaid, unrelated to the estate. I forwarded it to Lily. She responded with a formal note of non-liability and a copy of the signed release agreement they'd submitted weeks earlier. I didn't add a comment. I didn't need to. There were no more messages after that. I started going back to the Hartley store once a week. Not to manage. Just to be there. To sit at the old desk. To smell the faint scent of sawdust and floor polish. To watch how people moved in that space. A young man named Jordan took over as assistant manager. Bright. Steady. Reminded me of myself at 20, unassuming, observant, quietly efficient. I mentored him without saying I was doing it. Just as Grandpa had done for me. Once, while reviewing delivery logs, he asked, "Did you always know you'd end up here?" I replied, "No. But once I arrived, I knew I wasn't leaving." He smiled, nodded, and went back to his spreadsheet. Some legacies aren't passed down. They're built, inch by inch, in the shadow of what others tried to break. That winter, I finalized the paperwork to open a second vocational scholarship, this time in Grandpa's hometown. The paperwork bore my name as founder, but his as the namesake. The announcement was small. Just a notice in the local paper. No interviews. No press release. It wasn't about that. It was about repair. And as I mailed the last envelope of that application cycle, I felt something shift. Not relief. Not pride. Just steadiness. Like the ground beneath me had finally stopped moving. But that night, while filing the last of the estate documents into my personal archive, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Tucked behind the final ledger. A receipt. Dated 6 months before his passing. For a safety deposit box. In his name. And mine. Some things aren't meant to be opened quickly. They wait. Not out of secrecy, but because they understand timing better than we do. The safety deposit box was located in a small, unassuming credit union just outside Elm Grove. The kind of place where clerks still greeted you by name, and pens were still tethered to the counter with curled cords. I showed the receipt and my ID. Signed a ledger. The woman behind the desk walked me to a steel door and turned a key that squeaked softly as she twisted it. Inside, the box was heavier than I expected. Not physically, emotionally. I waited until I was alone in the private viewing room before I opened it. No piles of cash. No secret accounts. No dramatic final instructions. Just a few things that made my throat tighten without warning. His pocket watch. The one I used to play with as a child, fascinated by the clicking sound it made when you wound it. A small, folded photo of me sitting on his lap in front of the first store. I was 7. Holding a clipboard like I was in charge of something important. And a sealed envelope marked with his initials. Inside, a letter. Handwritten. Careful. Unrushed. It wasn't long. It didn't explain anything I didn't already know. But it did say this. Amber. If you're reading this, it means you stayed steady. It means you didn't let them break you. I've watched the world try to shrink women like you. Too competent. Too quiet. Too hard to manipulate. You held the line. Now build something better. Love. Grandpa. I didn't cry. I just sat there for a long time, holding the letter, breathing in the stillness like it might anchor me. There are moments in life when the noise finally stops, not because everything is solved, but because you're no longer afraid of what happens next. That was one of those moments. I closed the box. Returned the key. Walked out into the cold January light and felt the wind hit my face without flinching. The following week, I turned 30. There was no party. No family brunch. Just a quiet morning and a warm drink and a calendar that no longer made me feel like I was behind. I didn't send out invitations. But I did make a list. A real one. Of what I would carry forward, and what I would leave behind. The need for approval? Gone. The weight of obligation to people who couldn't see me? Gone. But the ledger stays. The letters stay. The values stay. And the stores, every one of them, are now officially operating under a new mission statement. One line, printed on every employee handbook, subtle but deliberate. Integrity isn't spoken. It's built. There's a photo of Grandpa in the front office at Hartley. We didn't frame it in gold or put flowers under it. We just put it where it belonged, at eye level, next to the Employee of the Month wall. Every time I visit, someone has added a note to the corner. A memory. A thank you. A joke he used to tell. No one was told to do it. They just did. That's legacy. Not money. Not titles. Just the slow, deliberate way people remember how you made them feel when they were learning how to hold their own shape. Sometimes I walk the aisles after hours, when the store is empty and the lights are low. I run my fingers along the old shelving units, still solid after decades of use. And I think about the difference between inheritance and inheritance. One is what you're given. The other is what you choose to protect. I haven't spoken to my mother in nearly 8 months. Rachel sends photos sometimes. Of her kids. No captions. No commentary. Just small glimpses. I respond when I can. Not out of duty. Out of choice. Because forgiveness doesn't always mean reconnection. Sometimes, it just means you stop letting people define what love should cost you. The estate is closed. The stores are stable. The scholarships are expanding. And the silence in my apartment doesn't ache anymore. It holds. There's still one letter I haven't opened. It's from Lily. A handwritten note she sent after our final meeting. Marked, when you're ready. It sits in my drawer, next to Grandpa's. Not because I'm avoiding it. But because for the first time in my life, I don't need answers. I already have my own. And that's enough.